The thing about living in a building with 32 units was that you learned very quickly how to be invisible. Nadia Osei had perfected this art over 2 years in the Halcyon, a mid-rise apartment building in Portland, Oregon that was slightly too expensive for what it offered and slightly too quiet for what it cost. She knew her neighbors the way you knew background music, aware of it, occasionally noting it, never really listening. The couple on the 4th floor who argued in Portuguese. The elderly man on the 2nd who kept a very opinionated cat. The rotating cast of graduate students on the 6th who threw parties that ended, without fail, at exactly 11:15 because they all had early labs. And then there was 7C. Dr. Shin Junho occupied apartment 7C the way a roomer occupied a room. You were always aware of him without quite knowing why. He was tall in a way that felt almost inconvenient for elevator small talk. He was quiet in a way that felt deliberate rather than shy. He had dark eyes that Nadia had noticed exactly once, in the lobby mirror, before she'd looked away and decided firmly that noticing her neighbor's eyes was not something she was going to make a habit of. They shared a floor. They shared an elevator occasionally. They exchanged the specific brand of nod that Portlanders had perfected, acknowledging, cordial, deeply noncommittal. For 2 years, this was the entirety of their relationship. Then, on a Tuesday in November, he collapsed in the lobby. Nadia had been returning from the farmer's market. A canvas bag heavy with butternut squash and a loaf of sourdough that she'd been unreasonably excited about all morning. She'd pushed through the glass front door and there he was, her neighbor from 7C, crumpling sideways near the mailboxes like something had simply gone out of him, like a lamp unplugged mid-sentence. She dropped the bag. The sourdough rolled under a bench. "Hey!" She was at his side before the word had finished leaving her mouth, which surprised her. She'd always thought of herself as someone who assessed before acting. Apparently her body had other opinions. "Hey, can you hear me?" He was breathing. She confirmed this first, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his throat, the way she'd learned in a first aid class 8 years ago that she'd taken mostly for the CPR certification her company required. His pulse was there, rapid and thin but present. His face was gray at the edges in a way that frightened her more than she'd expected. She called 911. Then she stayed on the floor next to him, her hand on his shoulder, talking to the dispatcher in a voice she was keeping very deliberately calm, while her heart was doing something erratic and unhelpful inside her chest. The paramedics arrived in 6 minutes. In those 6 minutes, she learned that his name was Dr. Shin Junho. She'd known the last name from the mailbox, never the first, and that he was 34 years old, and that the only emergency contact in his phone, which she'd found in his jacket pocket at the dispatcher's instruction, was a contact labeled Nadia, neighbor, 7F. She stared at this for a long moment. She had never given him her number. The hospital was the particular kind of busy that only hospitals and airports achieved. A controlled chaos with its own internal logic, everyone moving with purpose, the fluorescent lights making everyone look slightly more worried than they actually were. Nadia sat in a plastic chair in the ER waiting area and tried to remember why she was still here. She had given them his information. She had confirmed she was his emergency contact. A statement that had felt deeply strange in her mouth, like wearing someone else's coat. She had answered their questions. At any point in the past 40 minutes, she could have said, "I don't actually know him. I'm just a neighbor. I've done my duty here," and walked out into the Portland evening and retrieved her sourdough from under the bench and made the butternut squash soup she'd been planning. She did not do this. She sat in the plastic chair and thought about the contact in his phone. Nadia, neighbor, 7F. He had her number. She had never given it to him, which meant at some point he had borrowed her phone. She cast back, 6 months ago. She remembered now a brief thing. He'd been in the elevator, his own phone dead. He'd asked to borrow hers to check something, returned it in under 2 minutes, barely spoken. And at some point during those 2 minutes he had, apparently accidentally or semi-accidentally, saved her as a contact. And then listed her as his emergency contact. She could not decide if this was careless or lonely or both. It's both, she thought. It's definitely both. At 11:40 p.m., a nurse found her in the waiting room and told her that Dr. Shin was stable, that he'd been severely dehydrated and exhausted, that his blood pressure had dropped precipitously from overwork and undereating, and that he was asking, with what the nurse described as considerable embarrassment, who had come in with him. His neighbor, Nadia said. The nurse's expression said, "That's unusual," while her face said, "I've seen stranger." "Would you like to see him?" Nadia thought about the soup. She thought about the sourdough probably still under the bench downstairs. "Sure," she said. The room was dim and smelled like antiseptic and the particular brand of recycled air that hospitals kept at a temperature designed to remind you that you were mortal. Shin Junho was propped against 2 pillows with an 4 in his arm, and the expression of a man who had recently been forced to confront something very uncomfortable about himself. He looked, Nadia thought, significantly less intimidating horizontal. He also looked exhausted in a way that went beyond one bad day. It was the kind of tired that had been accumulating for a long time, settling into the skin, making itself at home. He looked up when she walked in. There was a pause. "You're my neighbor," he said. His voice was slightly rough, which she attributed to the 4 and the general ordeal of the evening. 7F, she confirmed. Another pause, longer this time. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, part gratitude, part embarrassment, part something more careful. "I listed you as my emergency contact," he said. It was not quite a question. "You did. I didn't mean to. I gathered that." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something in his face had shifted. The careful guard down a fraction, the embarrassment settling into something more honest. "I borrowed your phone in October," he said slowly, as though reconstructing a crime scene. "I must have. I didn't realize I'd saved my number and then listed me," Nadia said. "Yeah. I'm sorry." He said it simply, and she believed him, and that was what made her stay in the doorway instead of saying "It's fine. Get well soon" and leaving. "You didn't have to come. You didn't have to stay." "No," she agreed. "But you were unconscious on the lobby floor and it felt like the decent thing." He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like the precursor to one, like light before sunrise. "Thank you," he said, "for the decent thing." She pulled the visitor's chair close to the bed and sat down. "How are you feeling?" "Like an idiot," he said immediately. "Medically. Also like an idiot medically." He glanced at the 4. "Dehydration. Low blood pressure. They're saying I need to eat." He said this last part with the tone of someone who found eating an inconvenient administrative task they kept forgetting to complete. Nadia looked at him. "When did you last have a real meal?" He was quiet for a moment too long. "Dr. Shin." "Tuesday," he said. "It's Tuesday. Last Tuesday." She stared at him. "That's 7 days, yes, I know." His jaw tightened slightly. "I've been in surgery. The cases have been," he stopped, pressed his lips together. She could see him doing the calculation of how much to say to a stranger. "It's been a difficult stretch." "A difficult stretch," she repeated. "You collapsed in a lobby." "I'm aware. The lobby of our building." "Also aware. Because you hadn't eaten in a week." He turned his head slightly on the pillow to look at her fully, and for the first time she got the full effect of those dark eyes from a distance shorter than a mirror reflection. They were very direct, she noted. The kind of eyes that made it difficult to say things that weren't true. "Are you going to lecture me?" he asked. "I'm a graphic designer," she said. "Lecturing doctors about health seems outside my lane." And yet, she agreed. Then, because it was almost midnight and she was tired, and they were already well past the normal boundaries of neighbor interaction, she said, "Is there someone I should call? Family? A friend?" The pause this time was different, heavier. "No," he said. "There's no one to call." She absorbed this, thought about the contact list in his phone. She hadn't gone through it, but she'd seen enough to know it was sparse. Thought about a man who had somehow, accidentally, made his only emergency contact the woman who lived across the hall and had never once learned her last name. "Okay," she said. She stayed until 2 in the morning. She didn't know why. Neither did he. But at some point she'd started talking about the farmer's market, about the butternut squash soup she'd been planning, about the sourdough under the bench that was probably not salvageable. And he'd started listening with the particular focus of someone who'd been running so hard for so long that the simple act of someone else's voice was something he didn't quite know what to do with. He fell asleep around 1:30. She stayed another 20 minutes, watching the monitor confirm steadily that he was fine, and then she gathered her jacket and left quietly. She found the sourdough on her way out, still under the bench, slightly dented. She took it anyway. He came home on Thursday. Nadia knew this because she heard the elevator and then heard the specific sound of a man trying very quietly to manage getting to his apartment without running into anyone. And she opened her door anyway. He was still in the clothes he'd been wearing Tuesday, dark trousers, a dress shirt with the top 2 buttons open, the jacket folded over one arm, and he looked better than he had in the hospital but still carried that deep bone tiredness. He was also, she noticed, carrying nothing except his phone and his keys, which meant either someone had brought him home or he'd taken a rideshare straight from the hospital without stopping anywhere. He stopped when he saw her. The hallway between their doors was not long. In 2 years, she'd never really noticed how short it was. "Hey," she said. "Hey," he said. "A beat. Are you okay?" she asked. "Better. They want me to rest for a week." He said this the way someone might announce they'd been sentenced to hard labor. "That sounds like a good idea. I have patience. You also have colleagues, presumably." He stopped. His jaw did the thing again, the tightening, and she was starting to understand that this was what it looked like when Shin Junho was trying not to admit something. "My colleague is covering. For the week." "Good." Another beat. He was looking at her with something complicated in his expression. Gratitude again, underneath which was something that looked almost like bewilderment, like he was trying to figure out the math of why she was still here, still engaged, still looking at him like a person she was actually interested in. "I should," he gestured at his door. "Do you have food?" she asked. He blinked. "I'll order something. Come over for dinner," she said. And then, because she heard herself and understood how that had sounded, she added, "I made the butternut squash soup. I made a lot of it. And I feel strange having been your emergency contact for 2 days without actually knowing your name." He was quiet for a moment. "Juno," he said. "Most people just say Juno." "Nadia," she said and held out her hand. He looked at it for a second, this small, offered thing, this ordinary gesture made strange by the particular strangeness of the past 2 days, and then he shook it. "Come over at 7?" she said. He came over at 7. The soup was good. She knew it was good. She was a reliable cook who took no particular pride in it, but also no false modesty. He ate 2 bowls. He did this with the focused application of a man who had been reminded recently and dramatically that food was a biological requirement, and she watched this without commenting, which she thought was the correct instinct. Her apartment was warm and slightly cluttered in the specific way of someone who worked from home. A drafting table in the corner with color samples pinned to a corkboard, houseplants in varying states of success, books on every flat surface including, she noted now with mild embarrassment, 2 of them open to pages she'd flagged weeks ago and never returned to. He looked around with the quiet attention she was beginning to understand was just how he looked at things. "You're a designer," he said. "Graphic design. Mostly brand identity. I work with a lot of small businesses, some larger clients." She ladled more soup into his bowl before he could say he didn't need it. He didn't protest. "You're a surgeon. Cardiothoracic." She paused. "So, heart surgeon." "Yes. A heart surgeon who forgot to eat for a week and didn't bother to call anyone when he was running himself into the ground." He smiled for the first time. It was a brief thing but real. A slight curve at the corner of his mouth, the kind of smile you earned rather than performed. "When you phrase it like that, how would you phrase it?" "A temporary lapse in self-management during a particularly demanding caseload. That's a very clinical way to say you almost died in the lobby." "I didn't almost die. You collapsed. Dramatically," he allowed. "But not fatally." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, but also the ease of it. How quickly they'd arrived here, at something that felt almost like banter, after 2 years of elevator silence. She thought about that silence now and tried to remember if it had felt empty. She didn't think it had. It had just felt like silence. This felt like something else. "Why no one to call?" she asked. She asked it simply, without particular weight, because she'd been thinking about it since Tuesday night and the question felt honest rather than intrusive. I assume you have people." colleagues, friends. He was quiet for a moment, turning his soup spoon over in his hand. I moved here from Seoul 4 years ago, he said eventually. My residency was in Boston, my fellowship in Chicago, and then the position opened here. He paused. I've been moving a lot. It's difficult to maintain. Another pause. People, she repeated. I have colleagues I respect. I have a sister in Seoul I talk to once a week. He set the spoon down. But it's different. The people here, he glanced up. I haven't been particularly available. For people. For anything outside the hospital. She thought about this. About a man so caught inside the enormous machinery of keeping hearts beating that he'd let everything else go quiet by degrees. So gradually he maybe hadn't noticed the silence until he was on the floor of a lobby with no one to call. Is that by choice? She asked. Or by habit? He looked at her for a long moment. I'm not sure I know the difference anymore, he said. It was an honest answer. It startled her, how honest it was. How this man who had been so quiet, so self-contained, in the hallway for 2 years, was capable of saying something that clean and true across a dinner table after 2 bowls of soup. Well, she said, I know your name now. He looked at her. That almost smile again. Nadia Osei, he said, and she realized he must have seen it somewhere. Her mailbox, probably, or her door. He'd known her name. He'd just never used it. Shin Junho, she said back. Outside the window, Portland was doing its November thing. Rain against the glass, the distant sound of a streetcar, the city settling into its wet, quiet evening. The soup pot was still warm on the stove. The lamp on her drafting table made the room look amber and unhurried. He stayed until 10. He thanked her at the door with a formality that would have felt stiff if she hadn't already understood that this was just how he was. Careful with things, deliberate, sincere in a way that had no need to perform itself. Get some sleep, she said. Doctor's orders. Or, I suppose, your doctor's orders. Ironic position to be in, he said. Extremely. He left. She cleaned the soup pot and thought about I haven't been particularly available and I'm not sure I know the difference anymore, and felt something quiet and notable settle in the space behind her ribs. He knocked on her door Friday morning at 9 a.m. with 2 cups of coffee. She opened the door in her pajamas and paint-stained socks, her hair in a bun that had given up halfway through, holding a pen she'd been using to mark up proofs. She stared at the coffee cups. I don't have a coffee maker, he said. It was both an explanation and, in its way, something close to an apology. I've been getting it from the place on Morrison. I got 2. She took the cup. Oat milk. Black. I didn't know what you. Black is perfect. She opened the door wider. Come in. I'm in the middle of something terrible. You can be appalled. He was slightly appalled. Not at the apartment, which was the same apartment from Thursday evening, warm and layered and very much lived in, but at the proofs spread across her kitchen table, which were for a client's rebrand and which Nadia was in the process of annotating with a particular energy that he would later describe as surgical. This is what graphic designers do at 9 a.m. on a Friday? He asked, looking at the color swatches and the printed brand guidelines and the 7 open browser tabs on her laptop. This is what I do, she said. The client is a restaurant group and they want their brand to feel warm but modern, but also timeless and also slightly unexpected, which is the design equivalent of asking for a room that's both red and not red. She circled something on the proof. The logo works. The typography is fighting me. He sat down across from her without being invited, which she noted as a new development from the careful formality of last night. He studied the proofs. Can I look? Knock yourself out. He looked at them with the same focused attention he seemed to give everything. She watched him from behind her coffee cup. The secondary font, he said. It's slightly too formal for the primary. She stared at him. You can see that? It creates a tension. Like the headline is relaxed, but then the body text is standing at attention. He turned one of the proofs toward her. There's a mismatch. She looked. He wasn't wrong. She had been circling this feeling for 3 days without landing on it, and he'd seen it in 2 minutes. Do you have a design background I don't know about? She demanded. No, I look at proportions. In surgery, the relationships between things have to be right. A slight imbalance is often visible before it's technically measurable. He set the proof down, modest about it in a way that meant he wasn't performing modesty. It's probably different. It's exactly the same, she said. You're insufferably perceptive. He smiled. The full version this time, brief still, but both corners of his mouth involved. It did something to his whole face. That smile. She filed this information away with the brisk efficiency of a woman who knew that filing something away was not the same as not noticing it. She fixed the typography. It took her 40 minutes and he read one of her books. A novel she'd left open on the table, Pachinko, which he said he'd been meaning to read for 2 years. And they sat in her apartment with the rain coming down outside and said nothing for long stretches, and it was completely comfortable. This was the most alarming development so far. He started walking in the evenings. The hospital had suggested it. Gentle movement, fresh air, no 16-hour surgical days, which she imagined was the hardest prescription he'd ever been given. She knew he was walking because on the second evening she'd come out for her own walk and found him in the lobby at the same time, and they'd exchanged a look and he'd held the door and then they'd walked to the river and back without deciding to. They talked. This was the other thing she was beginning to understand about Shin Junho. The silence was not absence. It was the pause before he said something that was actually worth saying. He didn't fill space for its own sake. When he spoke, it was because he had something. And when he listened like it mattered. She told him about her work. About the way she'd wanted to be an architect as a child but discovered she was more interested in the emotional language of visual things than the structural. Not how it stands but what it says. About the clients who thought branding was decoration and the ones who understood it was identity. About her mother in Accra who called every Sunday and who had strong opinions about the fact that Nadia lived alone in a rainy city and kept odd hours. My mother has similar opinions, he said, smiling at the river. She calls the hours I keep medically irresponsible. Your mother is right. She's a retired physician. She's always right. It's profoundly unfair. What kind of physician? Cardiologist. He glanced at her. It's a family pattern. My father is a surgeon. My sister is in psychiatry. My mother says we have a pathological relationship with other people's suffering. Do you? He was quiet for a moment, watching the river. The lights of the Burnside Bridge made yellow ribbons on the water. I don't think it's about the suffering, he said. I think, for me, it was always about the moment before. The moment when a heart that was failing starts beating correctly again. When something broken becomes, for a moment, whole. He paused. It sounds grandiose. It sounds like a person who knows exactly why they're doing what they're doing, she said. He looked at her. That's a generous reading. It's the accurate one. A beat. The river moved. A couple walked past them going the other direction, sharing an umbrella, their laughter trailing behind them like a comet tail. Why are you being kind to me? He asked. He said it without self-pity, just with the clean curiosity of someone who genuinely wanted to understand a thing. She thought about it honestly. Because you were a person who needed someone, she said. And I was there. And I think those two facts add up to something simple. It doesn't feel simple from where I'm standing. No, she agreed. I suppose it doesn't. They walked back in the light rain. Not touching, not quite. The space between them was the kind that has its own weather. The week turned into 2 weeks. This happened gradually and then unmistakably. He cooked for her on Wednesday. This revealed 2 things. First, that he was a better cook than she'd expected from a man who forgot to eat for 7 days, and second, that cooking was one of the things he did to manage whatever was always running underneath the controlled surface of him. He made doenjang jjigae, fermented soybean paste stew with tofu and vegetables, with a focus and a quiet that was different from his hospital focus. This was restorative. She sat at his kitchen counter with a glass of wine and watched him and thought that this was the most relaxed she'd seen him, which was saying something, given that he'd been medically ordered to relax for 2 weeks. His apartment was sparse. Not cold, there were books and a few framed photographs she didn't look at too closely, and a very good record player that she hadn't expected, and a collection of records that ranged from classical to Chet Baker to a handful of Korean indie artists she'd never heard of. But there was less of him in the apartment than there was of her in hers. Less accumulated life. as though he'd been in transit long enough that he'd stopped fully unpacking. She asked about the photographs while they ate. My parents, he said. My sister Jion and her daughter. A friend from medical school who is now in Singapore. He was quiet for a moment. And my senior resident. He's the reason I went into cardiothoracic. Was? He set down his spoon. He died 18 months ago. An accident. He said it in a measured way that told her it was not measured at all, that it was contained with effort. He was 41. He'd been telling me for years to slow down, that I was going to burn out, that the work would take everything if you let it. Pause. He was right, as it turns out. She was quiet, letting him have the space of it. Since then I've been doing too much, he said. I've been covering his cases, his patients. He stopped. I think I thought that if I kept moving fast enough, I wouldn't have to feel the stopping of it. He looked up. That probably makes no sense. It makes perfect sense, she said softly. You've been running from a room you were afraid to be in. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression, not surprise exactly, but recognition, the particular quality of someone seeing their own interior reflected back at them clearly for the first time in a long time. Yes, he said. That's it. And instead you collapsed in a lobby. And instead, he said, with a rueful quality that was entirely him, I collapsed in a lobby. She refilled his water glass. He watched her do it. The domestic ordinariness of the gesture seemed to catch him somewhere. Seemed to mean something he didn't have words for yet. You should talk to someone, she said. Professionally. Not about the physical stuff, the hospital covered that. But about, she gestured generally. The grief, he said. The grief. He nodded slowly. Not the defensive tightening this time. Just a nod, honest and a little tired. I know. He exhaled. I've been knowing I should do that for about 14 months. So. He picked up his spoon again. I'll call someone tomorrow. Good. They ate the rest of dinner listening to Chet Baker and not talking about it anymore because she understood instinctively that he'd said as much as he could say right now, and that the most useful thing she could do was simply be present without requiring anything more from him. This was something she was good at. She'd always been better at being with people than most people expected, which was ironic given how thoroughly she'd also mastered the art of being alone. Jion called on Saturday morning while Nadia was there. This was not by design. Nadia had knocked to return a library book. He'd lent her a Korean short story collection. She'd read it in 2 days and brought it back. And he'd been mid-call, and he'd waved her in with an expression that was one part apology and one part, she thought, relief to have her there. She could not understand the Korean, but she could understand the tone. The older sibling warmth, the intermittent scolding, the familiar kind of love that sounds like worry because it is. She sat on his couch and looked at his records while he talked, and she heard his voice change on the phone into something softer and slightly younger, and she thought that this was another version of him she was being given access to, and that she was being careful with it. He hung up after 10 minutes. She says I sound different, he said. Different how? More. He seemed to search for the word. Present. Nadia turned over a record sleeve in her hands. Norma by Bellini. She hadn't expected opera. Are you? He was looking at her. Yes, he said. I think I am. There was a specific kind of silence that happens between two people when something has just been said that is also, underneath itself, something else. This was that silence. It lasted about 4 seconds, which is a long time when you're inside it. Then she put the record sleeve down and said, "Make coffee." And he went to the kitchen and made coffee, and the moment passed, except that it didn't, because those moments don't actually pass. They just move underneath the surface of things and continue being true. He went back to work on a Monday. Nadia knew because she heard his alarm at 4:45 a.m. through the wall that separated 7C and 7F. A wall she'd never previously been aware was thin enough to carry sound. And then the sounds of a person moving through an apartment at speed in the pre-dawn dark, and then the door and the elevator, and then silence. She lay in her bed for a while after that. The walks didn't stop. They'd moved to early mornings on his non-surgery days, or late evenings on the ones that were, the time shifting to accommodate him, and she'd adjusted her schedule around it with a naturalness that she examined at intervals with a slightly skeptical eye. You like him, she told herself, which was honest and fine and something she was allowed. You like him a lot, she added, which was also true and slightly more complicated. You were his accidental emergency contact for 2 days and now you're reorganizing your mornings. She concluded, which was the summary version of a development she was choosing to keep a close eye on without yet deciding what to do about it. The problem was that he was careful. Carefully kind, carefully present, carefully everything. And she could not always tell if the carefulness was him maintaining a boundary or him building towards something slowly and deliberately in the way he seemed to do most things. He was not a man who did anything by accident. Except, apparently, emergency contacts. She started to think about that again. The contact in his phone. Nadia, neighbor, 7F. He'd said he hadn't meant to, but he'd had her number for 6 months and he'd listed her, and she found herself turning this over at odd moments. In the middle of brand presentations, on walks without him, making coffee in the morning, trying to understand what it meant or if it meant anything, or if she was doing the thing where you take a fact and build an architecture of meaning around it that the fact cannot actually support. She was still thinking about this on a Thursday evening when he knocked on her door at 8 p.m. with takeout from the Korean place on Burnside that she'd mentioned once, 2 weeks ago, in passing, and she understood with clarity that this was not an accident either. You remembered, she said. You mentioned it. He said it simply, handing her the bag with the particular formality he deployed sometimes, the slight formality that was actually shyness. She'd come to understand, the careful packaging around something less composed. I mentioned it once. I remember things you say. The sentence sat between them. She took the bag. He was still standing in the doorway. She'd noticed that about him. He waited to be invited in, still, even though they were well past the stage of their relationship where doorways were necessary. As though he was aware of taking up space and preferred to be asked before doing it. Come in, she said, as she always said. He came in. They ate on her floor, which had become a thing. She had a perfectly good dining table, but the floor was warm by the radiator and there were always at least 6 books within reach, and she liked the informality of it. And he had, within 2 dinners, simply started sitting on her floor as though he'd always done it. His long legs folded awkwardly, and he'd shrug out of his jacket, and he'd look slightly more like a person and slightly less like someone in a constant state of professional presentation, and she liked this version of him with an intensity she was being thoughtful about. Bad day? She asked. Long day. He'd learned to make this distinction, which she took as progress. I had a patient, a woman, 63, whose surgery went well. The kind of case that reminds you. He paused. Dae-hoon would have loved it. She waited. He was the best I've ever seen, Junho said. Not technically. Plenty of technically perfect surgeons. He had something else. He could look at a patient and see the whole person. All of it. The fear, the life they were fighting to get back to. The specific weight of what they'd lose if it went wrong. He looked at his food. I've been trying to learn that. I didn't realize until he was gone that he'd been teaching me all along. I think you already have it, Nadia said. He looked up. The way you talk about your patients, she said. You don't just say the case. You say the woman or the man. You remember the specifics. The weight. She picked up her chopsticks. I think he taught you better than you know. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the rain had started up again. Portland's relentless November rain, reliable and unhurried. I called the therapist, he said. Yeah. Second appointment is next Tuesday. He said it in the direction of his bibimbap. Then he glanced up. It's harder than I thought. To say the things out loud. That's usually how it works. You've done it. Therapy? Yes. After my dad died, about 4 years ago. She said it without flinching because she'd made her peace with it, and also because he'd told her true things and she wanted to offer the same. I thought I was fine because I was functioning. Turns out functioning and fine are very different conditions. Yes, he said like she'd named something. Yes, exactly that. They looked at each other. The rain said its rain things against the window. Her lamp made everything amber. There were 6 books within reach and takeout from the place she'd mentioned once, and a man on her floor who remembered the things she said and had accidentally made her his emergency contact and had somehow, in the span of 3 weeks, become the most present thing in her life. Oh, she thought quietly. There it is. She had a work trip in December. 4 days in San Francisco for a client presentation and 2 days of her own leisure because she had a friend there Amara, whom she loved and didn't see enough, and the timing worked. She told Junho this in the elevator on a Tuesday morning, casual, just information. He nodded. Of course. A beat. When do you leave? Thursday. He stopped, seemed to recalibrate. Text me when you land? She looked at him. Sure, she said. He looked at her for a moment, the kind of look that lasted just a fraction of a second too long to be entirely casual. And then the elevator opened at the lobby and he held the door and they went their separate ways. She texted Amara that evening. Something is happening with my neighbor. Amara texted back in 40 seconds. What neighbor? You said your neighbors were boring. He was boring. He was quiet. And now he's not boring. Not boring how? Nadia thought about this for a genuinely long time. He makes fermented soybean stew and listens like it matters and remembers every small thing I say, and last week, he saw a font problem in my work that I'd missed for 3 days. Pause from Amara's end. Then, Nadia. That's not boring. That's you're in trouble. I know, she typed back. What are you going to do? She looked at the wall that separated 7C and 7F and thought about alarms at 4:45 and walks to the river and coffee cups and a soup that had become a first meeting. Nothing yet, she said. I'm being careful. Or scared. Amara sent back, with the gentle ruthlessness of a 12-year friendship. Nadia put her phone down and did not respond to this, which was, she recognized, its own kind of response. San Francisco was good. Amara was good. The presentation went well, the clients were enthusiastic, and Nadia walked across the Golden Gate in cold fog and felt, for a few hours, the particular freedom of being somewhere that didn't have her daily life in it. She texted Junho when she landed, as promised. He replied, good. Eat something better than airplane food. She texted him a photo of the dim sum she had with Amara. He sent back, that's adequate. This made her laugh in a way that Amara noticed. Show me, Amara said. Nadia showed her the exchange. Amara read it and looked at her and said, Nadia, he's not your neighbor anymore. She searched for the word. I know, Nadia said. Do you like him? I like him very much. Does he like you? I think so. I think he doesn't entirely know what to do with that yet. And you? She looked out the window at San Francisco doing its winter thing, the fog over the bay, the particular cold that came off the water. I'm waiting, she said, for him to catch up to himself. And if he doesn't? She thought about it honestly. Then I'll say something, she said. I'm not, she paused. I'm not built for indefinite waiting. I know what I am and what I want. But I think he needs a little more time to know those things for himself. Amara looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been her friend for 12 years and knew exactly what she was looking at. You are so much calmer than I would be, she said. I'm terrified, Nadia said honestly. I'm just calm about being terrified. She came home on Sunday evening. The building was quiet. She took the elevator, juggling her carry-on, and when the doors opened on the 7th floor, he was in the hallway. He'd clearly just gotten home too. Still in his work clothes, the dark jacket, the slightly rumpled look of a long day. He had takeout in his hand, and he stopped when he saw her, and something moved across his face that she wouldn't have been able to name 2 months ago, but that she could name now. Relief, she thought. He looked relieved. You're back, he said. Just now, she said. They stood in the hallway. The particular hallway between 7C and 7F that she'd stopped thinking of as short and started thinking of as exactly the right size. I have too much food, he said, lifting the bag slightly. I was going to, he paused. I'd like you to come over, if you haven't eaten. I haven't eaten, she said, which was true. Then come over, he said. She left her carry-on inside her door and crossed the hallway and went into his apartment, and he turned on the lamp and put on a record, Chet Baker, Almost Blue, which she'd heard 3 times now in this apartment and was beginning to associate very directly with him. And he reheated the food and she sat at his kitchen counter and thought, this is what it would be like. This easy, this quiet, this warm. She was thinking this when he turned around from the stove and looked at her and said, without preamble, with the directness that was just how he was, I missed you. The sentence was simple. The way he said it was simple. There was no hedge on it, no qualifications, no strategic retreat. Just the fact offered plainly. She met his eyes. I missed you too, she said. Something settled. Something that had been held carefully in a neutral position for 3 weeks just settled. I don't entirely know what I'm doing, he said. I'm aware that my circumstances are still. He put the spoon down, turned fully toward her. I'm in therapy for grief I've been avoiding for 1.5 years, and I collapsed in our lobby a month ago, and I am, by my own assessment, not in the most. Junho, she said. He stopped. I'm not asking you to be finished, she said. I'm not waiting for you to be fixed. I'm just, she gestured, slightly helplessly, at the space between them. I'm right here. He looked at her for a long moment. The record turned. The lamp made everything amber. Outside, Portland was being Portland, rain and the quiet and the city going on with its business. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her where she sat on the stool, close enough that the space between them had become a decision rather than a distance. He reached out and tucked a loose piece of her hair behind her ear, a gesture so careful and deliberate that she held very still for it, and then he said quietly, I know you are. She tilted her face up. He looked down at her, and his expression was the most open she'd ever seen it. No containment, no measuring, just him, fully present, in the room. He kissed her. It was a gentle thing, not tentative but careful in the way all things with him were careful, thoughtful, given fully when given. She kissed him back with the calm certainty of someone who had been sure of this for a while and was glad to have arrived at it. When they broke apart, Chet Baker was still playing and the food was slightly too hot on the stove and she was smiling and so was he, and it looked good on him, she thought. It looked like something he might get used to. December moved into January. They did not make announcements. There was no formal conversation where they outlined terms. It happened the way things happen between careful people, gradually and then completely, and with the feeling of something that had been true for longer than they'd said it out loud. He brought her coffee on mornings she had early calls. She left soup in his fridge before his long surgery days, labeled with post-its that she sometimes put small drawings on, nothing elaborate, just quick sketches, a small cartoon of a stethoscope, a heart with a note that said, "Eat this, please." He did not tell her this was the best thing anyone had done for him in 4 years. But she suspected, and she let him carry it quietly. They walked. They cooked. They sat in her apartment with books and in his apartment with records, and sometimes they talked until midnight and sometimes they didn't say much at all. And both things were equally comfortable, which she'd come to understand was one of the primary measures of a thing worth keeping. His sister Jion video called one evening when Nadia was there. This time, she didn't move to give him privacy. He didn't gesture for her to. She sat beside him on the couch and Jion appeared on the screen. Warm-faced, curious, with dark eyes that looked like her brother's, and said something in Korean that made Junho's jaw do a slightly different thing than usual, and then switched to English smoothly. "Nadia," Jion said. "He talks about you." "Jion," Junho said, warning. "What?" She should know. "He doesn't talk about people." Jion leaned toward the camera. "He has mentioned you in approximately 11 separate phone calls. For him, this is equivalent to writing poetry." Nadia laughed. Junho looked at the ceiling. "She's exaggerating," he said. "I am not exaggerating even slightly," Jion said cheerfully. "I'm a psychiatrist. I don't exaggerate, I overdiagnose." She smiled at Nadia. "Take care of him." "He's doing a pretty good job himself," Nadia said. "He is," Jion agreed, and something in her voice went softer, and she glanced at her brother with the particular love of a sibling who has been worried and is less worried now. "He really is." After she hung up, Junho sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then he set it down and said, 11 calls is probably accurate." Nadia rested her head on his shoulder. "Good," she said. He put his arm around her. Outside, it had started snowing. A rare thing in Portland, light and tentative. The city blinking at itself in quiet surprise. "I have a question," he said. The emergency contact thing." She lifted her head, looked at him. "I've been thinking about why I listed you," he said. "I've been in therapy, I've been looking at the things I do and don't do and why. And I think," he paused, "I think I listed you because I'd seen you in the elevator for 2 years, and there was something about you that felt safe. Like someone you could trust even before you knew her." He looked at her. I don't think it was entirely an accident. She considered this. Not entirely, she agreed. I think some part of me knew that if something happened, you would stay. And I did. And you did. He was looking at her with that full, open look that she still hadn't entirely gotten used to. I didn't know it was going to... He gestured between them, in exactly the same helpless gesture she'd used in his kitchen that evening in November. This. No one does, she said. That's sort of the design. Whose design? She smiled. I don't know. Bad planning on the universe's part. He laughed. The full laugh, the one that was a little rare and completely real and did things to the room when it happened. She'd been quietly collecting these laughs for 2 months and she planned to continue. What do we call it? He asked. What do you want to call it? He was quiet for a moment. Something, he said. I want to call it something real. Then it's something real, she said. We'll figure out the word later. He pulled her back against his shoulder. Outside, Portland was snow-dusted and very quiet, the city gone soft at its edges. The record player was on. Something slower, something she didn't recognize. A woman's voice in Korean that rose and fell like water. She felt his arm tighten slightly around her. She felt, under the warmth of his shoulder, his heartbeat. Steady and present and real. The heart of a man who spent his days tending to other people's and had nearly let his own run dry. She thought about the lobby, the farmer's market bag, the sourdough under the bench, the contact in the phone. Nadia, neighbor, 7F. She thought about how much of life happened in the before, all the tiny, invisible, accidental architecture of moments that you didn't know were building toward something until you were already inside it, until you looked around and recognized the room. She was inside it now. So was he. Neither of them had meant to. Both of them were glad. There is a particular kind of Tuesday in February in Portland when the sky can't quite decide if it's going to rain or not, and the light has the thin, watery quality of a city trying to remember what warmth feels like, and everything feels faintly provisional, faintly possible. On one such Tuesday, Nadia updated the contact in her own phone. She scrolled to Junho. She'd entered him simply as Junho back in November, on the day she'd gotten home from the hospital and thought she should probably have the number of the person whose emergency contact she'd accidentally been, and she looked at it for a moment and then she edited it. She changed it to Junho, 7C mine. She put her phone down and went to make coffee. At 4:45 a.m., his alarm went off on the other side of the wall. At 5:15, there was a knock at her door, and he was standing in the hallway with 2 cups from the place on Morrison, and she was standing in her doorway in her paint-stained socks, and he looked at her with those very direct dark eyes, and it was a completely ordinary Tuesday. She had never been so fond of a completely ordinary Tuesday. Come in, she said. He came in. The door closed on the empty hallway, the particular hallway between 7C and 7F, which was not short at all, she'd come to understand. It was exactly as long as it needed to be. Just enough space between 2 doors for an accidental collision, a borrowed phone, a dropped bag of groceries, and the careful, lucky, entirely improbable beginning of something that now had a name. Something real. He never meant to need her. She never meant to stay. But some accidents are less accidental than they look, and some emergency contacts turn out to be exactly that. The person who shows up in the lobby of your life right when everything gives out. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, leave us a comment. Also like, share and subscribe to our channel, and click on the notification bell to get notified whenever a new story is made.